I never imagined that a few hedges could start a full-blown HOA nightmare. When I first moved onto my property, the backyard was quiet and private, shielded by decades-old hedges that had grown tall and thick over the years. They weren't just plants, they were a living wall, a boundary that marked where my space ended and the outside world began. I spent weekends pruning, watering, and tending them, enjoying the small sense of sanctuary that came from owning land that felt truly mine. The property itself was modest, but well-loved. A cozy house sat near the back of the yard, and the hedges curved along the perimeter, giving the space an enclosed, intimate feel. It was far enough from neighbors that mornings felt serene, evenings peaceful, and no one ever questioned where one yard ended and another began. I had meticulously kept records of property lines, deeds, and surveys tucked safely in a drawer, never expecting to need them. The past few weeks had been routine, pruning, trimming, clearing debris, but all of that was about to change in a way I could never have predicted. It started with a knock on the front door. I opened it to see her, a sharply dressed woman holding a clipboard, a tight smile plastered across her face. She introduced herself as part of the HOA leadership. At first, I thought this would be a simple conversation about neighborhood updates or minor concerns. Instead, she immediately began listing complaints about my hedges. According to her, they were blocking the view of other homeowners and needed to be cut down or trimmed drastically. I was taken aback. The hedges had been there for decades, and no one had ever complained. I tried to remain calm and reasonable. I explained that the hedges marked the edge of my property, that they were healthy and well-maintained, and that cutting them down would destroy the privacy and aesthetics of my yard. I even offered to compromise in minor ways, trimming only certain sections or planting new shrubs along visible sight lines, but she dismissed my suggestions outright. Her tone was firm, her body language insistent. "This is a community standard," she said, "and everyone needs to comply." I noticed a few neighbors watching from a distance, some curious, others looking concerned. Over the next few days, letters appeared, formal, typed, and stamped with the HOA seal. They cited rules I had never agreed to, regulations that didn't apply to my lot, and warnings about fines if the hedges weren't adjusted to their specifications. I read each one carefully, making notes, photographing dates, and keeping a detailed log. There was no negotiation, only insistence and escalating pressure. Despite the surprise and frustration, I remained composed. I reviewed my deeds, checked property lines on official surveys, and documented the hedges' boundaries. Everything was in order. The backyard was legally mine, and the hedges were clearly within my rights. Yet, something about the way she had presented her case, the absolute certainty, the implied authority, the expectation that I would comply, made it clear that this wasn't going to be a polite disagreement. It was a battle over control, and I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go to assert it. The first letter from the HOA didn't feel like a friendly reminder. It felt like a warning. It was formal, typed, stamped with their official seal, and left on my porch. It claimed my hedges were violating community aesthetics and demanded that they be cut to a height and shape I had never agreed to, under threat of fines. I reread it carefully, noting the dates, the signatures, and the exact wording. There was no room for discussion. Compliance was expected, and failure to comply would carry financial consequences. I called the HOA office, trying to handle it the way I always handle disputes, calmly, with facts, and with the expectation that reason would prevail. The receptionist transferred me to the board member I had already met at the driveway. She spoke with a clipped, rehearsed tone, repeating the same phrases about community standards and shared views. I explained, once again, that my hedges were entirely within my property line, that the backyard had been private for decades, and that I had deeds and surveys to prove it. She acknowledged none of it. Instead, she repeated that the issue would be escalated and hinted that fines would begin soon. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Another notice appeared, this one more urgent, claiming I was obstructing traditional sightlines and suggesting that the HOA had the right to alter or trim anything they deemed offensive. I knew this was absurd. The supposed traditional view had not existed for decades, and certainly no legal easement gave them the right to enter my property. Yet the tone of the letter made it clear that they hoped fear would replace facts. Neighbors began to notice. Some stopped by to whisper about the HOA drama. Others avoided eye contact. Rumors circulated that I was in violation, that I was refusing to cooperate, that the HOA had authority over my yard. None of it was true, but repetition is power, and I could feel the narrative forming. The same day, someone had apparently called a local inspector. He showed up without warning, clipboard in hand, asking about property lines and alleged violations. I calmly walked him through the surveys, the deeds, and the property boundaries. He nodded, took notes, and left, making it clear in his tone that everything was within my rights, but the HOA had already planted doubt. I began keeping a meticulous log, dates of letters, photographs of the hedges, and copies of all communications. Every fine, every notice, every claimed violation went into the record. It wasn't about revenge yet, it was about protection. Every interaction became evidence, every word documented. I knew the HOA thrived on pressure and ambiguity. I refused to give them either. Then came the first formal hearing. It was scheduled at a local community center, listed on the HOA's agenda with my property as the subject. I attended, not because I recognized their authority, but because I wanted to ensure there was a public record. Inside the room, she sat at the center, clipboard ready, exuding confidence. Board members murmured amongst themselves, residents peeked over the edges of chairs, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. She spoke first, emphasizing community standards, tradition, and aesthetic responsibility. When I presented the facts, the deeds, the surveys, the historical record of the Hedges, her dismissive smile remained. She claimed her son had always assumed the view should belong to the neighborhood and implied that my hedges were an intentional provocation. I kept my tone calm and measured. Ownership isn't subjective. Facts are facts. By the time I left, no resolution had been reached. Instead, I returned home to another notice. Fines would begin if I failed to comply immediately. The language was vague, the threats implicit, and the intention obvious. They were trying to intimidate me into submission. And in that moment, I realized the situation had grown beyond polite negotiation. It was no longer about hedges, it was about control, and I would need more than calm words to defend what was mine. By the following week, the situation escalated from bureaucratic annoyance to full-blown intimidation. Inspectors arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand, walking through my yard and taking notes as if I had somehow invited this chaos. Each step they took felt heavy, like an attempt to validate the HOA's threats. I calmly showed them the property lines, the deeds, and the surveys, all meticulously documented. Every response was factual, professional, and unemotional. Yet even as the inspector nodded in agreement, his presence alone was enough to signal that the HOA was willing to push the limits of authority. Then came the surveyor hired by the HOA. He stood just outside the fence line, snapping pictures and jotting measurements. I asked him politely to leave, explaining that private property could not be claimed for community access without legal easements. He hesitated, clearly trained to assert presence without direct confrontation, then left, but not before capturing images that would later be used as leverage. It became apparent that this was no longer about hedges. It was a calculated effort to wear me down through constant observation and implied intrusion. The fines began soon after. Small amounts at first, almost symbolic, but they were issued daily, each one claiming a violation that didn't exist. I documented each notice, every envelope, every stamp, and stored them in a growing binder. Neighbors whispered about the HOA drama, sharing snippets of the story with curiosity or concern, while some avoided my property altogether. The narrative was shifting. I was no longer a homeowner minding my own yard. I had become the villain in their story, and repetition had made it believable for anyone who didn't check the facts. The tension hit its peak when a county deputy appeared, explaining politely that he had been called to conduct a welfare and compliance check. I invited him inside and methodically walked him through all the documentation, the property deeds, survey maps, photos of the hedges, and records of correspondence. He acknowledged, quietly and professionally, that everything was in order. He left without issuing citations, but the underlying message remained clear. The HOA was willing to drag outside authorities into this battle to pressure me into submission. The psychological strain was palpable. I spent late nights reviewing old property plats, measuring fence lines, and documenting every hedge tip, every inch of border. Each interaction with the HOA added weight to the record I was building. Their narrative painted me as unreasonable and obstructive, while my every move was calm, legal, and entirely within my rights. That contrast fueled a quiet determination inside me. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding or a casual disagreement. It was an orchestrated attempt to intimidate, manipulate, and force compliance. The final straw came when I noticed survey stakes driven into my yard overnight, marked with notes suggesting a proposed easement. No notice had been given. No permission had been requested. This wasn't oversight or error. It was a direct attempt to claim part of my property. I removed the stakes immediately, photographed everything, and added the evidence to my growing dossier. The stakes were symbolic. They represented a line crossed, a challenge issued, and the need for a response that was more than polite letters. For the first time since the hedges were trimmed, I shifted from reaction to strategy. The confrontation had revealed the HOA's methods: pressure, escalation, and misrepresentation. But I had something they didn't: clear, historical evidence and the patience to prepare a defense so meticulous that no claim could withstand it. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, and I didn't retaliate impulsively. I began quietly gathering the tools I would need to turn the tables: legal support, surveyors, historical documentation, all aligned and ready. By the end of that week, it was no longer about hedges at all. It was about control, perception, and the certainty that I would not allow intimidation to override the law or my rights. The stage was set for a turning point, and I knew exactly how I would act when the moment came. Once I decided to stop reacting and start preparing, everything changed. I spent the next several days focused entirely on gathering irrefutable evidence, building a case so airtight that no threat or claim could stand. The first step was digging into historical records. I went to the county archives, not just the online portals, but the physical files stored in climate-controlled drawers. Among yellowed papers and dusty ledgers, I found the original property plots from decades ago, maps that clearly showed the boundary lines where my hedges had grown for generations. These weren't modern interpretations. They were inked, stamped, and recorded long before the HOA or its members had any authority. Each record told the same story: my hedges, my yard, my property. Even the so-called traditional view that the HOA claimed as communal access was nothing more than a construction path used once during development decades prior, never formalized, never legally recorded. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA's arguments weren't just weak, they were fabricated. Their authority existed only in their imaginations, reinforced by repetition and intimidation. I hired a professional surveyor to confirm everything. We walked every inch of the property, iron pins and boundary markers verified against archival maps, photographs, and legal plats. The surveyor's report was precise and unemotional. Every measurement aligned. Every stake, fence, and hedge documented. He even commented that this was the kind of documentation that could end any dispute before it started. The reassurance was quiet but powerful. For the first time, I felt an internal shift. Control was moving from them to me. At the same time, I organized legal consultation. I didn't want threats or harassment. I wanted clarity and permanence. Together, we compiled a full packet: deeds, surveys, correspondence, photographs, and a timeline of every interaction with the HOA. Nothing was emotional. Nothing was accusatory. Every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged and ready to stand up in any formal setting. The idea wasn't to attack. They could keep yelling and threatening, but to create a foundation so solid that any attempt at intimidation would collapse on its own weight. I also began preparing my response strategically. I decided to act at the exact moment when their next move could be anticipated but not executed, turning their own aggression into an opportunity. Every letter they sent, every fine they issued, every survey stake they placed overnight was photographed, cataloged, and added to my file. The more they tried to push, the stronger my position became. By keeping meticulous records and maintaining calm, I ensured that my next step would be both legal and visually undeniable. Finally, I started planning the actual barricade that would act as both a physical and symbolic line in the sand. Rusty shipping containers, heavy and imposing, were arranged on paper first. I calculated spacing, placement, and impact, how they would block the view, prevent access, and send a message without a single word. It was precision over emotion, strategy over chaos. While the HOA had relied on fear and repetition, I relied on history, facts, and calculated action. By the end of the week, everything was ready. The surveys were complete. The legal documentation was airtight. The containers were sourced, measured, and prepared. I had turned intimidation into strategy, anger into planning, and confrontation into preparation. The stage was set. When the moment came to act, it would be decisive, undeniable, and irreversible. For the first time since the hedges were cut, I felt a deep, steady confidence. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control, protecting what was mine, and finally showing that facts, preparation, and patience could overcome entitlement and threats. The next move would change everything. The day finally arrived. I had arranged everything with quiet precision. Rusty shipping containers, heavy and imposing, were positioned along the edge of my property, perfectly aligned to block the view and prevent any unauthorized access. They weren't placed out of anger. They were placed strategically, legally, and symbolically. This was not retaliation. It was a clear, undeniable statement of ownership. When HOA Karen arrived later that morning, clipboard in hand and confidence radiating, her reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widened, her jaw tightened, and for the first time since this entire conflict began, her composure cracked. She had assumed intimidation and persistent pressure would eventually force compliance. She hadn't accounted for preparation, for facts, for decisive action executed calmly. The containers loomed between her and the hedges she wanted removed, a silent, immovable barrier she could neither argue with nor ignore. Neighbors began noticing the scene, some peeking curiously from behind fences, others stopping to take in the spectacle. A few whispered in astonishment. The homeowner had turned the tables in a way that was both creative and legally undeniable. Word of the barricade spread quickly, and the narrative shifted from HOA authority to entitled HOA thwarted by savvy homeowner. Their assumptions were unraveling before their eyes. Even her son, who she had repeatedly invoked as the rightful beneficiary of the view, approached cautiously. He asked questions, curious and hesitant, about the property lines, the legality of the containers, and the history of the hedges. I explained calmly, showing him the deeds, surveys, and documented correspondence. The look on his face was one of realization. What he had assumed as entitlement was nothing more than imagination. The evidence was indisputable. The HOA, for all their threats and warnings, quickly became powerless. Fines, notices, and meetings no longer carried weight. Their attempts at intimidation were rendered moot by meticulous documentation, strategic action, and clear property boundaries. The story had shifted from confrontation to resolution. I had restored control over my property without ever breaking the law or losing composure. The backyard was mine, private, and entirely respected. The emotional relief was profound. I walked along the newly blocked perimeter, inspecting the hedges that had been the catalyst for this battle. They were untouched, thriving, and fully under my care. The shipping containers, once just heavy metal, had become a symbol, not of anger, but of perseverance, preparation, and clarity. I had defended not only my property, but the principle that entitlement and threats do not override facts and rights. In the weeks that followed, peace returned. The hedges flourished without interference. Neighbors began to greet me with renewed respect, curious about how the situation had resolved. HOA Karen's visit stopped, and the tension that had once hovered over the yard dissipated. The backyard, once a stage for conflict, became a sanctuary once again, a testament to strategic patience, careful documentation, and calculated action. As I stood on the edge of the property one evening, the sunlight glinting off the rusty metal of the containers, I reflected on the journey. This had been about far more than Hedges. It had been about authority, entitlement, and the lengths some will go to claim what isn't theirs. Yet through preparation, calm, and strategy, the outcome had been clear, just, and undeniably mine. The conflict was resolved not with emotion, but with foresight, skill, and patience, a lesson the HOA would remember long after the Hedges had grown back. For the first time in months, the yard was peaceful. The Hedges, the house, and the shipping containers all stood in quiet harmony. HOA Karen could scream all she wanted, but the story had been written in deeds, surveys, and decisive action. The truth endured. My property, my boundaries, and my hard-won peace were finally secure.